Join me, Harriet Gould, for the Lab Matters podcast to hear fascinating stories every week from the inspiring people behind the science. Join me, Harriet Gould, for this episode of Lab Matters to hear from Ben Valsler, digital editor at Chemistry World, about everything from field research in Indonesia to live radio and the origins of Viagra. Today we are welcoming digital editor at Chemistry World, Ben Valsler, formerly of The Naked Scientists. We'll come on to that. Science-wise, Ben, you've done all sorts and been all over, and you're even a self-described jack of all trades, but you're very, very much in the science remit. And I just wondered, was that always on the cards?
I think it probably was. I didn't grow up around scientists. Both my parents were teachers, so they were generalist primary school teachers. My mum was head of reception and deputy head at a primary school. So education and knowledge and an interest in and thirst for knowledge, certainly. But science in particular came mostly because for the vast majority of my childhood, I wanted to be a vet. That was the thing that interested me most. It was going on to have a career as a vet. It didn't work out, but that was definitely the driving force that sort of pushed most of my interests. I was very interested in wildlife, animals, that side of science. I was vegetarian from the age of 8 because of my love for animals. And up until I got to A levels and had a real taste of what the day-to-day job of being a vet is. So I worked in a vet 2 afternoons a week throughout my triple science A levels. And one day I walked in, and I didn't really want to do it anymore. And
What did you see? What was it?
I don't think it was any individual thing. Obviously, I was a work experience person in a vet, so you get all of the slightly unpleasant jobs. There's a lot of cleaning up. There's a lot of sort of holding on to stuff and moving things around, and not any of the real veterinary side of things. But I'm not entirely sure, and I think I've always struggled to come to terms with the fact that that was when I had my moment of realization. But I think I was quite lucky because the training you do to become a vet is hard. It's hard and it's long, and the early stages of the career are challenging. And had I had that realization in, say, year 2 of a veterinary degree, then I think my life might have ended up very different. Whereas having it just before I went to university, which gave me time to reassess and to take a different path. And as it happened, I stuck with the sort of animal side of things and went on to do a degree in zoology. Because it happened then, I got all of that out of my system, and I went on to really enjoy my studies and to complete university, go on to do a master's, do a bit of travel with my undergraduate research and so on. So I'm glad it happened, but at the time, it really did feel like all of my ambitions had fallen down around me, and I wasn't really sure what to do with myself for a few months.
Was it big animals or small animals, or did it not matter at that stage?
I enjoyed learning about and being with big animals, but the vast majority of a veterinary career, or most of the opportunities, are for pets. And it was certainly a small animal vet that I was working with. There were a few opportunities sort of slightly outside that. So they worked with a local racetrack, for example. So we did occasionally go and see horses in stables and that sort of thing. But mostly it was cats, dogs, guinea pigs, and so on. I always had a fascination with primates, so I was very fond of monkeys and apes. I also did a week working at Dudley Zoo, which at the time had a good great ape exhibition and or enclosure, I suppose. And I really enjoyed spending time with, in particular, the orangutan there, who was quite a strong personality and had a bit of an issue with the head keeper there. And the story goes that there had been a fire in the enclosure years before this, and they were trying to encourage the orangutan out of the enclosure and into a cage, and he did not want to go. He had no interest, even though it was clearly an evacuation situation. And so the head vet had no choice but to basically frighten this orangutan into this cage, and ever since then, the orangutan had just despised him, and so it made for an interesting bit of interspecies drama, because whenever the head keeper was there, this orangutan got very worked up. And I think I was probably 15 or so when I was there. That was very eye opening as to the character that these animals can have, and the power, because this orangutan almost pulled the door off its hinges. It was a strong
Mm.
animal. So I had a bit of experience both with larger animals in very sort of unnatural environments, obviously, but also the day-to-day veterinary stuff. There are a few things working at the vet that have always stuck with me. One was a dog that, unfortunately, this is not a particularly pleasant story, but he was very constipated, and he was very constipated because his owner was feeding him things like chicken carcasses, and so he was eating too many bones, and we had to do open surgery on that dog in order to remove the blockage and free him up, as it were. And that was very much against the clock. There were questions as to whether the owner could afford the surgery, and obviously the alternative was not very nice for the dog. And the surgery itself was long and hard and visceral, literally visceral. And
Mm.
there was one point when the vet shouted at me to just go and open every door I could, because the smell was appalling and was
Mm.
really distracting. But the surgery worked. The dog was fine. The owner found some way to pay for it. But that was a real eye opener as to the decisions that you have to make and the potential outcomes as a vet, and the fact that the vet thought this was the right thing to do, but the owner may have just had to say no for
Mm.
no reason but a financial one, which is a hard thing to be part of. The other thing that really sticks with me is pet rabbits. I don't know if you've ever had a pet rabbit.
Guinea
Uh,
pigs, no rabbits.
Guinea pigs might be similar, actually. Out in the wild, rabbits eat a lot of quite hard foods, and they have these big teeth at the front that are for gnawing through things and helping with digging and so on. So their teeth get worn down naturally, and they automatically stay the right sort of length. Pet rabbits don't do the gnawing. They eat softer food, they eat prepared foods and so on. So their teeth can get too long.
Mm.
And the way that vets deal with overly long rabbit teeth is with essentially a pair of industrial nail clippers. And I can still feel the feeling that shot up my arm when I was invited to have a go at clipping a rabbit's teeth, and it still makes me shiver a little bit today.
Yeah.
So there were a lot of there were a lot of memorable experiences, but there was just something about it. Something switched in me. Obviously, I was maturing at the time, but not yet mature. I was an A-level student. Something switched in me, and I realised that wasn't the life that I had
Mm.
in mind, and I then probably didn't pay as much attention to my A levels as I should have done. I pursued other interests for a little while, and ended up going to university in Aberystwyth to study zoology. Aberystwyth, an excellent place for marine biology, very good zoology department. Also, I grew up in the Midlands. Aberystwyth is sort of the closest seaside town, so there are quite a few of my friends and colleagues from the Midlands who also headed to Aberystwyth. So I knew it was a sort of safe bet in that regard as well.
Hmm. So you had did you have triple science to take you to Aberystwyth, or was it a little amalgamation of things?
So I did biology, chemistry, physics at A level back in the old A levels before the ASs came in, and
Hmm.
I did okay. There was also a general studies which we were encouraged to do at the time. But that's actually my last formal chemistry education was back at A level. So I have an A level in chemistry, which oddly enough I did better in that than I did in my biology. But I think that was because I was complacent, because I thought biology was easy. Physics I knew I had to work at, and those results were enough to get me into Aberystwyth. And once we were there, uh, the only bits that I really had to catch up on, and this was probably my first inkling of actually the diversity of things or diversity of skills that a scientist needs to have. Because I didn't have a maths A level, I did well at maths GCSE. I was encouraged, strongly encouraged by the university to do an additional module of sort of maths and statistics for scientists.
Hmm.
And that was something that I think I hadn't realized, that obviously when you're doing research, you need to be able to analyze that research in a statistically thorough way that can easily be communicated so that other people can go on to look at the research you did, reanalyze your data if they want to.
Hmm.
So that was my first inkling of that. Also, although I was studying zoology, there was a botany module in the first year, which again was a bit of an eye opener, and I realised that I really don't know very much about plants, and so that was another sort of catch up moment for me.
Hmm. So how long did you spend up in Aberystwyth, and what tell just yeah, tell me, I mean, did you have a really profound lecturer or anyone that sort of pointed you in a direction, and um where did you end up after that?
I think the lecturer that I remember, I mean, there were lots of good lecturers actually. In very different ways. So some were just really nice people to spend time with. Some were pretty sort of strict, but an old school in their teaching, but clearly knew so much about what they were teaching that they were inspiring for that reason.
Mm.
I've always remembered that the marine biology lecturer was ironically named Dr. John Fish, and he was a lovely chap. And one of the recommended books was A Student's Guide to the Seashore that he and his wife published. So it was A Student's Guide to the Seashore by Fish and Fish, and
Perfect.
I think I still have a copy of that somewhere. That really stuck in my mind. But he was an excellent lecturer. He was very useful in terms of pointing me in the direction of the weaknesses that I had, really, in not just in my general knowledge of science, but also in my approaches to it, where again, this may have been complacency sometimes. I didn't always do the research to the depth that I now realize you do need to do as a scientist. So I was there for 3 years. And in the summer between my second and third year, that was where I got my real taste of scientific field work. So I went and spent 2 months in Indonesia on a small island called Bhutan, studying the crop raiding habits of the Bhutan macaque. So I'm back to monkeys. And this was basically, I would sit in a hut, if I was lucky, on different farms. We had 7 different farms that we were watching. And I would record all animal and human activity
Wow.
from dawn till dusk. Uh, and then, and this is really where the statistics came in. So we were looking to try and see, well, what levels of activity, what types of activity, what species, what timings, and so on, what made a difference to the impact that the macaques could have on the farmers and on their crops. Because where we were in the world was somewhere that was sort of forcefully resettled. So when other Indonesian islands got overpopulated, then they would often ship families off to these smaller islands in order to ease the pressure. But that meant that there were relatively new farms that a generation or less ago were forest. They were unspoiled woodland where these troops of monkeys lived and found all their food anyway. So, from the
Mm.
monkeys' perspective, there's just more food in this bit all of a sudden. And it was interesting to see the different approaches that some people took, some more humane than others. So, there were examples of the monkeys being poisoned. And unfortunately, some of the farmers felt that the best way to stop the monkeys from stealing their crops was to put poisoned bananas in the forest around their farms.
Mm.
And it was through the sort of research that I was doing, and my supervisor and quite a few other organizations did similar research, and comparing it to uh, similar research done in Africa, for example, that we could start to actually advise the farmers that these other approaches are more effective. And we could show that the poisoning actually was deleterious. Poisoning in maybe a year's time would lead to more raiding, because you would affect the troop structure of one troop, because you'd kill off some of the big males who tended to
Mhm.
be the ones to get the food first. And that would then lead to sort of inter-troop squabbles, and you'd end up with a new troop coming in. So suddenly you actually have more monkeys than you had in the first place because you poisoned some.
Mm.
And some of them would, some of the farmers would shoot the monkeys, but generally the noise of a gun going off was enough to scare them away for now. So that sounds inhumane, but actually was less inhumane than it could be. But actually, the most effective, statistically, the most effective things that people could do were spend time on their farm, because monkeys spent significantly less time on a farm when there were people there, and own a dog. And all the dog really did was just bark a lot, because the adult male Bhutan macaques are quite intimidating creatures, and dogs would not fare well in an actual face to face battle with them. Um, and so the fact that the dog was there and could bark because there were
Mm.
monkeys there, and that would then alert the people, who would come out, shout a bit, and the monkeys would move on.
Mm.
So we were able to show that actually these less harmful techniques were actually better in terms of the monkeys and their life, and in terms of the farmers and their crops.
How
And
receptive were they?
so I had sort of moved on by the time that that research got there, but by and large, they were quite receptive. They understood, because they'd met so many researchers, they understood what we were doing and why, and they were happy to listen. I think there were a few who were sort of stuck in their ways, but the fact that we could demonstrate that this farm in the next village down used these approaches, and this was how much sweet potato they lost last season compared to you trying to do poisoning and you lost this much. I think having it laid out, having it communicated, and because we had really good community engagement as well, so we worked with the local communities very closely. With when we were there, we were staying in houses where the locals lived. Often
Mhm.
they would give us a room and we'd live in their house. So we were quite embedded in the community there as well. It's a little bit sort of parochial for Western scientists to turn up and tell people how they should be doing things. So there was
Mhm.
a lot of work as well in sort of training and working with the locals to understand why we're approaching things in this way, how we thought it could help, etc.
Mhm.
Um, and I think they did. Yeah, there were also paddy farms nearby, and we were able to demonstrate there actually your biggest predator, as it were, of a paddy farm is rats. And so they adopt different techniques there depending on where your farm is, what crops you're growing, etc. And because we had been out there doing the research, we could give them the evidence to show them which ways would be most effective.
Lab Matters is brought to you by the award-winning temperature control equipment from Polyscience, available worldwide. Polyscience, changing the world of temperature control forever. And I can't help wondering what's the motivation behind the research? Is it simply to teach students how to conduct research, or was there some bigger reason? Had somebody observed, oh, look, they're struggling with their farms because of these reasons? What was the driver
And
for
it's a
the
little
research?
bit of everything. So
Right.
it's partly research skills. So we had sort of qualified, experienced researchers out in the field along with students like myself. So it's partly an opportunity for us to develop research skills. So the university is very happy to partner with that. It's partly a conservation effort, because it's very clear that these animals are under threat, and
Mm.
one of those threats is human activity. There was plenty of other research going on in the same locations at the same time. So some looking at bird populations, for example, and how the level of disturbance in the forest affected the bird populations,
Mhm.
because there are birds on these islands that live nowhere else. And if you disturb the forest to the point where they can't live there anymore, then that's another species gone. And it's an extremely diverse, species rich, interesting part of the world. It's the Wallacea region, is where I was in particular, which is the area that is named after Alfred Russel Wallace, and clearly inspired him in his work. If you're not familiar with Wallace, he was a sort of slightly younger, but a contemporary of Darwin, who essentially came up with the same ideas at the same time. And it's thought, although this is very hard to prove, it's thought that Wallace starting to publish some of his ideas was the impetus that Darwin needed to actually publish what he knew were quite controversial ideas at the time, and clearly changed the face of science.
Mm. Well, yes, I can see why people agreed to do that then. That makes sense. Um, so tell me, Ben, I kind of want to talk about that for the rest of the time, but I feel like that would be a shame to miss out on some of the other things. Um, where was your first job after graduating? Or let's go from Aberystwyth. Where did you go first after that you didn't go straight to?
Well, I moved home and I started a fruitless job search for quite some time. I was looking at quite a wide variety of different science and science adjacent jobs, and I didn't have the experience really.
Mm,
I was fresh out of university. I had never been a scientific writer, so looking at sort of editor or assistant editor journal positions, I just didn't have what I needed for that. Um, and I just kept looking at various sort of entry level lab jobs and that sort of thing. But again, there were clearly far better, far more qualified people around. And so, although I spent a few months just applying for anything and everything, it became fairly apparent fairly quickly that I was going to have to take whatever work I could get. So I was ended up temping in various offices, worked in a factory for a while, a packaging factory. But while all of this was going through, I was still trying to keep myself involved uh, in work at zoos and that sort of thing. And I I was very, very lucky in that a an old friend of my dad's uh, organizes lecturing and teachers and volunteering opportunities overseas. And he knew somebody who had an inn at Bangkok Zoo.
wow.
And the
Now you're talking.
and the agreement, and you know, this is that's I'm not exactly sure if it's nepotism when it's a friend of the family, but it's not far off. But the agreement was that we would go up to but by this point I was with my now wife Jen. We went together. uh, we'd go to the northeast of Thailand, which is an area where they needed volunteer teachers, and we'd teach there for a while, get to know the culture, get to know the language, and then go down to Bangkok and work in the zoo there. And uh, we ended up not doing that. We stayed in the northeast of Thailand because we were enjoying the volunteer teaching that we were doing. So I taught in a community college, so that was the main volunteering, which was for young adults mostly, and people who had left formal education. So a lot of the courses were the IT skills, English language skills, things like catering and so on that would be driven towards employment. So being better at IT was clearly a useful thing if you wanted to work in many of the industries that were developing and still are developing in northeast Thailand at the time. But they also wanted a science course, and we were more than happy to get involved in that, not just teaching the existing curriculum, but writing our own, based around essentially teaching fairly basic science principles. So we weren't trying to teach quantum physics or astronomy, but we were teaching things like the basics of evolution, some of the aspects around hygiene and basic medicine and that sort of thing. And we wrote the curriculum to go along with that. And that was a fascinating experience because there was a significant language barrier, a very significant language barrier, because a lot of the people who were there were basically just starting to learn English, and we're trying to teach them about evolution and antimicrobials at the same time. So that was a real challenge, as to working out new ways to get the same messages across, interactive ways, hands-on ways, pictographic ways that
Mm.
didn't just rely on me standing at the front of a room and telling them something. And at the same time, I was also working as part of something called the Mini English Project at a local high school. So these were younger children, but they were more privileged children, because the Mini English Project was something that their parents would pay for them to get involved with. And the idea there was to enhance their English language abilities by having some of their lessons in English. So similar language barriers, but for different reasons. These people
Mhm.
were much younger, but clearly did speak a bit more English. And again, that time, although I was teaching an extant curriculum because it was a proper high school, there was also a project that I was able to encourage, which was very much a case of they set themselves a project that they wanted to do to demonstrate a particular thing, and that I found really fascinating to see the sorts of things that they would come up with and what they wanted to demonstrate and how they could communicate it.
Mm.
And both of those experiences were fantastic. But it was while I was there, as I said earlier, both my parents were teachers, and there was always, I'm not sure they ever said it out loud, but there was always the sort of undercurrent that my parents would not be enormously happy for me to go into teaching. Uh, I think they knew it was challenging and they could see the direction that the industry was going in, and so they sort of encouraged me not to. But while I was there, a couple of my colleagues at the community college started doing a nightly English hour on Thai local radio. And the idea with this was that they would have native English speakers. Now, I'm laughing when I say that because the two guys that ran it were German, but clearly spoke English probably better than I do, to be honest. Um, and they invited me on for a chat, and we played some music. And it quickly became apparent to me that the things I wanted to talk about was the science that I'd been teaching in the day. It was how interesting these lessons had been. It was these interesting principles and facts that I just really felt a need to share with people. And so I did that a few times. It really gave me a taste of being in a studio, of having to deliver something live, often in response to a question that I did not expect, and it still be satisfactory and factual and engaging, and a little bit about sort of how you write to be read out rather
Mm.
than writing to be read or to be researched or archived. And that then led me, while I was there, to start looking at science communication master's courses, because I thought, well, actually, this really does fire me up. This is something I would like to do. And I applied for several of them. I got very lucky. And again, there's been a lot of luck in my career moves so far, because I was one of the recipients of a Wellcome Trust student journalism bursary, which was for science communication courses specifically. It's a bursary that doesn't exist anymore. So there was a window when, by doing some interviews, and I remember being given a nature chemistry paper, as it happens, and told to summarize this for a lay audience, which I really did struggle with because it was didn't have an obvious hook,
Mhm.
but I got there in the end. And application forms and so on, and then another interview when I was back at home, and luckily that paid for all of my course fees and quite a lot of my rent for the year, because otherwise I would have really struggled to be able to afford a master's at that point.
Mm.
And that was a fascinating experience. I loved learning about the psychology of communication, the sort of theories behind science, and the ways that uh, we talk a lot about sort of objectivity, but objectivity isn't a real thing in any aspect of anybody's life. And so, what science is, rather than the search for objective fact, is a search for a consensus on what all of our different subjective experiences mean. So I can't remember the exact phrase, but I think it was something like a pan-consensual intersubjectivity. So the idea is that we all agree, based on the constraints of our equipment, our senses, our brains,
Mhm.
that this is as close to objective as we can get. And things like that, I just found it really fascinating. And the positive experiences that we had working with the BBC and radio studios, making short videos and editing them at a place called Films at 59, which is actually where they edit a lot of the David Attenborough wildlife series. Just really revealed to me that this was the thing that I did want to do. And I hadn't had that sense since that day when I walked into the vet and
Mm.
realized I didn't want to be a vet anymore.
Well, you say it was luck. It doesn't sound much like luck. It sounds like you worked incredibly hard and carried on searching. Um, and I'm glad you did, because that sort of eventually brought you here. But before you got where you are right now, you did a bit of a stint with the Naked Scientists.
I
Tell me
did a
about that.
long stint with the Naked Scientists, actually. So the Naked Scientist is a Cambridge University project uh, led by Chris Smith, who is an absolutely fantastic science communicator, has a phenomenal memory, really knows how to get the the crux of a story out of an interview with the scientist. Because of his memory, he's able to link it to so many other things that he has, you know, talked about before, researched, and so on. He's a clinical virologist himself, so he clearly knows his stuff. And I was a fan of the show anyway. So it is and remains a podcast. It's been going for, it must be over 20 years now, that podcast. But at the time, it was also a BBC local radio show, which gave it quite a quite a different feeling, because there was a level of interaction that most science podcasts still don't really have. And it was one of the first science podcasts. It was something I'd actually researched as one of my essays during my masters, so I knew a bit about the landscape and a bit about the people involved and the challenges. So I came across to Cambridge for an interview, and I saw in front of me, as I got to the Department of Pathology, which is where it was based at the time, somebody coming out of the door who I knew to be a BBC radio producer. And so I immediately thought, oh, well, I won't have got this job then. But luckily I did. And again, there's a bit of luck coming in there. I mean, she was a phenomenal producer as well. I'm not sure what happened there, but I'm very glad that it was me who landed in that role. And that again was a real step into the unknown. So I had
Mm.
never done proper live radio before in that sense. The English hour on Thai local radio was a very relaxed affair, I think it's safe to say. The bits that I'd done while doing my masters were all sort of pre-recorded elements, a little bit of very local radio, but this was a weekly hour-long show. We had to have content every week. We had to have interviews. We had to have news stories written. We had to have packages edited up. It had to go to time. You must start at the end of the previous show. You must not crash the news that follows. If your interviews are not going well, then you need to wrap them up quickly and find something else to fill the time. If your interview is going over, you need to make very rapid decisions as to what are we going to drop in order to continue this sort of golden interview.
Mm.
And I loved it. I really enjoyed everything that we did. The hours were long. The fact that we broadcast on a Sunday night was quite antisocial, but we did some fantastic things as a result. And I travelled the world, giving lectures, doing workshops, not just communication lectures, but also at sort of school outreach type events. So we had a live stage show, as it were, that we did all over the world, and that was also a fantastic opportunity. And the people that I met sort of stay with me to this day. That I feel very privileged to have been involved in that. And when talking to people about what I did, and this remains true at Chemistry World as well, one of the great things about being in science communication or science journalism is that you get to learn a lot of really interesting new things all the time, but you never have to do an exam.
I don't know what I remember. Bibby worked for Chemistry World when you went to Chemistry World. I can't remember if you went there first or I did. But I do know that we have, of course, worked together for quite a long time.
We have.
And as I said at the beginning, you're the digital editor. And that includes a whole host of things, and it's ever increasing, in fact. And we used to refer to Chemistry World as the Chemistry World magazine, and now we call it the Chemistry World portfolio, or simply Chemistry World, because of the digital prowess. And you've been at the helm of that since that digital leaning started, um, and you still get to learn a lot about lots of different things. Whether it's, your fascination with the boundaries. It says on your bio, even on the Chemistry World website, boundaries where specialisms meet and the magic happens. And when you host and what is it? Your master of ceremonies for the webinars. Um, but this whole idea that you're a jack of all trades. I mean, it doesn't strike me that you're a jack of all trades at all. It sounds like you're an expert in science communication and all things digital. But you say this boundaries area where the specialisms meet. And I'm really interested to know if you've got some examples of why you find them so fascinating.
It's hard to say, and it might be a function of the roles that I've had and the fact that I'm not an expert. I'm not a chemist. I have a degree in zoology, but I was never really a zoologist. And as a communicator, and especially as a journalist, your role is not to be an expert. Your role is to find the stories in what's going on, to work out why it is that this piece of research, well, and scientific research papers are frequently very dry, and they have to be by their nature because they need to be peer reviewed. They need to back up all of their statements with evidence or references. So a scientific paper is quite a dry thing. To turn that into an interesting and engaging story, you need to find hooks. You need to find things that will interest somebody who either knows nothing about it, or at the same time, somebody who is an expert. You need to be able to summarize it for them in a paragraph or two. And and it's looking for those hooks. That's where these interesting interface things come in. So when you're looking at new developments of scanning techniques, for example, that are then used to digitally unravel ancient scrolls that are impossible to unravel without destroying them. The scanning technique was never developed for that purpose, but it has allowed us to learn something else about the world that we could not have learnt without it.
Mhm.
More recently, there's been chemical developments and technological developments looking at storing data in DNA. So using life's data storage technique to store images, video, audio, text files, and so on, because it has the potential to be a much more stable long-term data storage than the current sort of magnetic discs and tapes and CDs and so on that we do use. And I just find those sorts of things really fascinating, where something was not developed with that outcome in mind.
Mm.
And it really opens up the fact that there are all of these other opportunities. And that's one of the things that makes science so interesting, because if you just drill down, look at a single paper or a single piece of research, it may not be immediately apparent how that could change the world. But actually, when you take a step back and look at it in the context and the way that other research has been used in a diverse way before,
Mhm.
then you start to see how these things really can make an impact. And the sort of old classic one is, of course, the story of Viagra, because Viagra was not developed for the purpose that it is now well known. It was a blood pressure drug. It was developed to help regulate people's blood pressure. But when they were clinically testing it, enough of the subjects reported a particular side effect, and they realized, well, actually, maybe that's the direction we could take this in, and that made millions for its owners. It again, it's obviously a very sort of publicly interesting story because it changed the lives of many people who'd been suffering for a long time. And I just really like how these things, they don't really fall into your lap, as it were, but there's this idea that chance favors the prepared mind. And I think as a science communicator, you have to be prepared to understand how this could be a fantastic story, or to see a potential in something that people who are less prepared just wouldn't be able to see. And that's where you find the stories. That's where you find the fascinating people that have really interesting things to say,
Mm.
because they are willing to sort of slightly step out of their own bound and look at the opportunities that every bit of research presents. And that there's often that sort of sort of dismissive argument when you look at some of the more obscure ends of science and you think, well, why are we paying researchers to do this nonsense that can only ever help in one thing? But actually, every bit of science piles together as part of that pan-consensual intersubjectivity in order to become the big picture that helps us to understand the world we live in and the way that we can change that world and the way that we can make it better for people, and sometimes the ways that we can make it worse and how we can perhaps make it better for more people in future.
Mm. I think that's a lovely way of putting it, and quite right as well. I completely agree. And I'll just say one more thing, where you tell me that you're lucky. I would say to you, chance favors the prepared mind, Ben Valsler. Just before we go, I've taken to asking people, well, putting them on the spot slightly, to tell me if there was one thing that you could change about the future of science, what would it be?
Oh, crikey. That is putting me on the spot.
It is. I'm sorry.
I think I would like to see science is expensive. There's a lot more that we could discover if we were willing to spend the money.
Mm,
We have to make decisions as to where to put that money and what is the research that we need. And I would like to see more scientists involved in making those decisions and fewer politicians. And I think it becomes very clear when you look at some of the bigger pictures around renewables and so on, and certain medicines, that often there are relatively short term political decisions and political decision makers who can influence the direction that science goes. And I think I'd love to see more money in science, full stop, for the reason I said before, that all of it is important.
mhm,
Um, but I think listening to the scientists more, we're very lucky in the UK that we have very good research institutions who do significantly contribute, but they all contribute within a political context. And I think allowing scientists to make more of those decisions, allowing the general good to guide a bit more of what we do, would benefit science enormously in the long run.
and then obviously benefit everyone else subsequently.
Of course.
Mm, lovely. Thank you, Ben. It's been a great pleasure speaking to you
Anytime.
today, and I will see you soon.